All right, so we ended the last discussion talking about dog psychology. And before we can talk about how we stop your dog's difficult behavior with lifestyle and training, which we'll discuss in the next video. But before we can talk about how you stop behavior, you need to understand how your dog's psychology and neurology is dictating that behavior. So behavior doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? Behavior is something that your dog practices in a pattern. Something happens and then your dog has a behavior. So this is a pattern. We call it patterns of behavior. And ultimately, behavior itself is self-rewarding. So to talk about that a little bit more, self-rewarding means simply it works for the dog. The neurological, physiological cycle of behavior and emotions for dogs is simple, and it works really similar to humans. So the nervous system itself gets triggered, and that trigger is going to correspond most with, remember from the dog psychology training, the last video, the early puppyhood socialization experiences, right? They get imprinted with their default operating system and how they think and feel about the world based on those experiences that they've had. So your dog at any stage in its life after this point gets triggered by things that it encounters, and then its nervous system has a response based on that early developmental experience, socialization, imprinting that occurred. So genetic and breed traits can also cause specific drives to get engaged without like formal conditioning or training. So you think like your terrier breeds are going to be really like prey driven because they were genetically bred to prey on vermin. You can think like your retrievers like to carry things. Your herding dogs like to chase and nip things and like drive things around. Your guardian breeds tend to be a little bit more territorial and standoffish and like aloof kind of thing. So there's certain like genetic and breed traits that can cause your dog to have specific trigger sensitivities, let's say. However, most dogs, the nervous system state is really dictated by the overall experiences that that dog had in the early puppyhood developmental stages between, 4 weeks all the way through 18 months old. And whatever drive is getting engaged based on the trigger, based on that association, based on their socialization experiences, right? They don't have, if you remember from the dog psychology training, the last video, dogs don't have episodic memory. So they don't like have PTSD style flashbacks to earlier points in life to remember how they should feel about things. No, instead their nervous system simply stores that feeling in response to a certain thing in life as like a default operating system. When this thing happens, you will just feel this way. And dogs don't necessarily know why. They don't remember why they feel that way. They just feel this way. And that feeling ultimately, that fight, flight, prey, play, freeze, fidget, any of these drives that are getting engaged for your dog, ultimately are dictating the behavioral response that they have. Fight drive being aggression, flight drive being like your fear responses, play drive being your excitement, prey drive being predation. So like when we think about our dog's behavior, we need to start thinking about it in terms of like what drive is being engaged and what caused that drive to be engaged. Also, what experiences did my dog have as a puppy that it would have this reinforced association of this trigger, right? When this trigger presents, my dog feels this way and then they behave this way. Well, ultimately, the behavior that projects in these moments either works for your dog or it does not, to either access, escape, or avoid the trigger in question, right? So thing happens, trigger occurs, and your dog either wants to access it, to escape it, or to avoid it. Just like, no, thank you. But they're not like trying to run away. So there's like a difference between escape and avoid, right? But or they're clearly trying to get closer to it, access it. But ultimately, the behavior that they offer in that moment either works to satisfy one of those three needs, right? Access, escape, or avoid, or it doesn't. And when a behavior works for the dog, they're going to continue to do it. That's why I said behavior doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's a pattern. It's something your dog is doing over and over again in this predictive cycle when triggers are present. And to break that cycle or pattern of behavior, we really need to understand this self-rewarding cycle of it so that we can understand then when is that perfect time to interrupt behavior so that I can address not just, again, the behavior itself, because that's symptomatic of deeper rooted nervous system dysregulation and a dog that's in a state of being triggered to an everyday reasonable stimuli, right? Reactivity itself and being behavioral is the result of having unreasonable reactions to reasonable everyday stress. So if our dog is having this unreasonable reaction, but that reaction is ultimately working for them to make them validate, reinforce this, I want to access, escape, or avoid the trigger in question based on the nervous system drive or emotional response, whatever you prefer, that got engaged based on their early developmental experiences in life, that's the thing you really need to understand. It's rather than try and focus on a dog's emotional state, which is what so many trainers are going to have you working on, is we need to change your dog's emotional state. We need to make things, your dog is fearful of something, so we need to make it more positive. We need to positively reinforce them to be near and around this thing, full stop. If a dog feels a certain way, you cannot just positively reinforce it to change that feeling. The dog's behavior itself is serving a function. So when dogs have behavior that is considered undesirable to us as humans, before we can just stop that behavior or try and change it, we first need to understand what function was it serving, because it served some kind of function. For the dog, it worked. Before we can start teaching a dog to make better choices, we need to understand the choice it was originally making and why it was making that. You don't need to know exactly what happened in the dog's traumatized history. Particularly in the rescue dog world, you're not going to know what happened to your dog that caused it to feel this kind of way and for it to start offering this behavior. And you're not going to know what led to it having the opportunity to practice that behavior over and over and over again so that it consistently felt good about making that choice. You're just not going to oftentimes know that information, particularly with a rescue dog. However, what you can know is that you cannot change the way your dog feels about something before you change the way that they are trying to self-address the situation. Their nervous system gets triggered. Immediately they go into this drive, this emotional state, and then they default into this behavior that has worked for them up until this point. Then that behavior feels good. So you need to understand before you start trying to teach your dog better choices or give them preferred alternative behaviors or make things feel good, you need to understand that what they're doing right now already feels really good for them. It's working for them. It's validating the way that they think and feel about the world. It's confirming the perspective they have. And ultimately, all animals are egotistical in the way that we'd like to be right. We'd like to confirm that our perspective of the world is accurate. That's all we're doing day to day. Same for dogs. And that's what your dog is doing. It's just trying to confirm the fact that it feels this way and it knows how to make that thing feel better. What your dog is doing works for them already. It already makes them feel really good. If you want to make them feel better than the behavior that they're offering is already making them feel, you have to first stop the behavior, right? You have to stop that default behavior. like I said, behavior doesn't exist in a vacuum. There's this whole neurological, psychological response that's powering the behavior that you visibly see and deal with as a human. And all of that feels really good for your dog already. So again, rather than try and focus on your dog's emotions first, we have to stop the behavior that's being offered because it's self-rewarding. We need to apply a layer of discomfort over that so that it no longer feels good for them and they start to question their reality. They start to question their perspective. They start to question the choices that they're making. If your dog feels like it makes good choices, it has no incentive to stop making its own choices. Ultimately, the choices you're trying to teach your dog do not feel better than the choices they are already making. You can get all of the high value treats out in the world, but none of that's going to compare to the instinctive primal feelings that your dog has when it's triggered. And if you want those feelings to stop, you have to make the behavior that's resulting from them feel a little uncomfortable so that it's no longer self-rewarding, it's no longer reinforcing, it's no longer validating, and your dog starts to ask what else they should do. What are my other options? If I cannot do this to make myself feel better, what else can I do? So, like I said, before we can go stopping your dog's difficult behavior and just arbitrarily issuing corrections and punishment, we need to understand what was this pattern of behavior to begin with, because it wasn't just them lunging and barking at dogs or at the male person or at a car or a trailer or a skateboard or a person walking towards you. Like, none of that was the reason that your dog has this behavior. Your dog wasn't traumatized by a trash bag blowing through the wind. Like, not everything comes back to your dog being physically harmed by something, and that's why it has some kind of trauma. More often than not, your dog simply wasn't exposed to something properly or at all. And so the way that their nervous system is responding to the stress is based on their instinct and lack of appropriate information, right? All dogs are craving is clarity, and what they're doing right now makes them feel clear. What they're doing right now feels good for them. It solves the problem in the moment for them. And in the absence of any other guidance or information, they're going to continue to do that. And what's even more interesting about this, because dogs have predictive nervous systems, their nervous system is always looking to keep them safe and always like make them aware of danger so that they can respond to it and validate that experience and make them feel better. And since they learn through associations and patterns of behavior based on what works and doesn't work, not memory, right? They don't have these PTSD style flashbacks. They think, oh, what worked in the past? And they like have these like really intuitive, logical trains of thought. They don't. What worked, what didn't. It's very black and white for them. And because they learn through these associations, they can be triggered by associations, not just the triggers themselves. So what this is really digging into is, if you have a dog that gets all excited as soon as you touch your leash, or they get all uncomfortable as soon as, like they get all anxious as soon as you touch your leash, or they get all like nervous or whatever it is, that's because that's how they feel on the walk. That's how they feel when you run into your triggers. They do not feel good out in the world, and they've learned that whenever you touch the leash, that's how they have to go feel. They can then be triggered by the association and not just the trigger themselves. So if you're in this kind of place, right, we have to start thinking through the dog psychology of the matter. How does your dog think and feel about these things, right? And how do we break through to help them feel better is ultimately the goal. And if you're not really sure if your dog is reactive or if they have a dysregulated nervous system, if this is kind of like your first time dabbling in the dog psychology world, I'll give you a list of really common behavioral symptoms that are tied to a dysregulated canine nervous system. And that would be like unreasonably barking, lunging, and growling at the leash at triggers and distractions. What dog, human, car, trailer, skateboard, like doesn't matter what they are exploding at. If they are having these unreasonably excessive emotional reactions to their experiences on the leash, when they're on leash or off leash, they are considered a reactive dog. Excessive barking, like for no reason. There's a dog somewhere in my community that just barks for no reason. That's a reactive dog. Easily triggered, excessive jumping and like attention seeking from humans, potty accidents, separation anxiety, generalized anxiety. You just have like an anxious dog that can't settle down and is always panting and stressed out. Pacing, doing donuts, chasing their tail, excessive grooming, counter surfing, compulsive digging, destroying things, resource guarding, nipping, biting, mouthing, chasing wildlife, and like excessive prey drive that you can't get control of, being just really absent-minded, ignoring you, unable to focus, eating things off the ground, super excitable. Like I said, they can't settle down, constantly sniffing, pacing. If your dog is doing any of these things, please stick around for the next training or go ahead and get started in Foundations, the do-it-yourself board and train designed for difficult dogs and service dog trainings at the link in the description of this video, where I can help you get all of these behaviors under control starting in the first 3 weeks. I'll see you in the next video where we talk about dog training and REST method, my proprietary proven holistic approach to dog training based in dog psychology, pack leadership using balanced communication, more in depth, so that you really know what we're doing differently here at Janna's Pack to help so many dog moms all over the world get control of their dog's behavior and start to love life with a calmer, well-behaved dog in literally as little as the first 3 weeks.